We're about 2 weeks away from the 2022 Beijing Olympics in China. Relations between Canada and China are at the worst they've ever been. China not happy when the House of Commons declared genocide of the Uyghur minority in China. Then there was the hostage diplomacy of holding the two Michaels in prison on trumped-up charges for almost 3 years in retaliation for the house arrest of Huawei exec Meng Wanzhou. Now, there have been threats and intimidation of Canadians on this soil for speaking up against the Chinese Communist Party. And considering the shoddy treatment, should Canada be sending athletes to these games? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand. The list of complaints is long. Crackdown in Hong Kong, intimidation of Taiwan, persecution of Tibetans and Uyghurs. In the face of all this, Canada is sending athletes, although it is standing with allies on a diplomatic boycott. China calls that move a farce, and Canadians are paying attention. Recent polls show Canadians do support a full boycott of the games. The eyes of the world will be watching to see if any comments or protests result in any reciprocal action. It's a complicated situation, and we have a number of guests to join us on the show today. Elliot Tepper is professor of political science at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Alan Freeman is with the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Margaret McCaig Johnson is a senior fellow with the Graduate School for Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Bruce Kidd is a former Canadian Olympian and a professor of sport and public policy at the University of Toronto. Kemi Lamo is a Tibetan Canadian activist, and Zumrate Arkin is with the World Uyghur Congress. And they all join us today on Unpublished TV. And Bruce, we're talking about sending athletes to Beijing, and you being the only athlete, I guess, one who went to the Olympics. Are they being used as political pawns, or do you feel they are being used as political pawns here?
I don't think so. I think that the athletes, with their eyes fully open, after 2 or 3 years of active debate among national level athletes, are eager to compete in Beijing for the Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games. I do not believe that any of them see their participation as an endorsement of the genocide in Western China or the long-standing occupation of Tibet, the crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong, and so on. But the Olympic Games were put in Beijing, and they want to compete in that. And although, as we'll discuss on this call, it's a very difficult terrain, they separate out their participation from support or endorsement of the Chinese government.
Elliot, Canada is engaging in a diplomatic boycott with about 7 or 8 other countries. Does Canada in particular Jinping really care if there's a diplomatic boycott?
I believe he cares a great deal if there's a diplomatic boycott, if it involved Vladimir Putin. Whether he cares about Canada coming or going, I suspect not so much. The fact that we have today, all the major news is about Russia. And I think we should probably pay attention to the geopolitical implications of Beijing at this time, hosting an Olympics in the middle of, an Omicron crisis. We know that Omicron is now in every major city in China. It's in the ports. It has now reached Beijing. So there's a real question, I think, of human security here. But beyond that, there's a geopolitical implication to China, absolutely determined to go ahead in the middle of this pandemic to prove that it is a geopolitical power. And I think keeping an eye on Russia and China and how they behave in the world, and the fact that the Olympics are being wrapped up into that geopolitics is well worth keeping an eye on.
Alan, you supported a full boycott. Is diplomatic the best Canada can do?
Well, it's interesting. I supported a boycott back in October of 2020, even at a time when the two Michaels were being held. I really haven't come back from that, backed off that view. I don't see, but I'll tell you, I'm actually feeling that China is actually perhaps going full ahead into a disaster for themselves, right? That we could end up being 2 weeks' time from now, this Olympic Games could be stuck in the middle of an Omicron wave in China, that they may not be able to actually continue to hold the games. Already, tourists aren't going, diplomats aren't going, American journalists aren't going for safety or whatever. So the whole thing, and the other thing about this, and I'd like to speak to Bruce about this a bit, is that
Sure.
these are not, we talk about these Olympics as Olympics. They're Winter Olympics. Nobody in India is watching what's going on there. Nobody in Africa really cares, right? So it's northern, places where there's snow. And so it's a smaller Olympics, which makes Canada very important. We were number 3 in terms of medals in Korea. So if we actually pulled out, there would be an impact. So there's this funny situation where, in some ways, this is not as big a deal as the Summer Olympics. And second of all, I think that the by trying to already, I'm not sure what China is winning from this, from these holding these games. Sure, they can pull it off, I guess, but certainly. But but in the eyes of the world and in eyes of the people who are watching in northern climates who are interested in Winter Games, I don't think China looks strong. I just think it looks authoritarian. So I'm not sure what they're getting out of it.
Okay. Margaret, you've worked on the Canada-China file for years. Has this relationship ever been worse?
No, it's never been worse. And we're not going to be forgetting about what happened to the Michaels. I think it will be a long time before things get even a little more positive. We'll continue to do business with China, but the love of China, I think, has been lost for a lot of us. I was a friend of China for 40 years. I'll never go back. I will not meet with Chinese government officials. I've changed my mind, and it's not just taking the Michaels. It's the militarization of the South China Sea. It's what happened with Hong Kong and Taiwan, potentially, and some of the aggressiveness that has taken place towards its neighbors. And more recently, we've seen the disappearance of Peng Shuai. For making an accusation of rape against a Politburo member. And, we still don't know where she is. And the IOC has been really complicit in allowing the Chinese government to detain her because they haven't insisted on her being allowed to travel and speak freely. And so, I think they have a lot to answer for on that front as well.
Now, Jimmy, I wanted to talk to you about intimidation coming from afar, and China obviously has its government supporters, and you've dealt with that firsthand in Canada. What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also an alum of U of T, so it's nice to see you here, Bruce. I think it was just right before you retired, I became Vice President Equity. And then followed by that, when I ran for presidency of the Student Union at U of T Scarborough, I got thousands and thousands of threats, death threats, rape threats. And, being an activist, I was aware that, oftentimes our organizations are subjected to these type of trolls and, bots. However, this was the first time I was seeing an experience where they were directly at me. And I remember posting an Instagram story saying, is this hate from China? And someone actually personally DM'd me and said, no, BITCH, I'm here. And then that followed with tons of death threats and rape threats, which basically posed not only a threat against me, but my family members, because there were comments like, your mom is dead. And that was something that I saw so often that I had to even call my parents time to time to check in on them without scaring them without letting it affect them and their mental health.
I'm wondering, when you get threats like that, do you report them to the police or do you just deal with it?
So it's been about 3 years and counting. I've spoken to various parliamentarians. I've spoken to the campus security at campus, starting from there, going all the way up to CSIS, our RCMP representatives, multiple interrogations or questions, but nothing so far that has made me feel more comfortable at home. I don't have any contact with my family members whatsoever. Not only that, none of my extended family members are able to contact any members that they know inside of Tibet without posing a risk on their safety. And till this day, I've worked with various coalitions submitting reports to Global Affairs, have closed door meetings with representatives from Global Affairs. However, no response yet. And even the low-hanging fruits is what I call as recommendations in the report was like having one point person where people like us would have an opportunity to go and they would understand. The amount of times I've had to deal with security officials that did not understand the geopolitical situation and the seriousness of this issue was quite disheartening as a Tibetan Canadian because, for me, I was born as a stateless refugee in India, and my parents came here to finally find a home that, gave them citizenship. And although we're grateful, I was not being treated like one because till this day, I have to tell people, isn't this a criminal offense to get a death threat, not only by one person, but I've received tons, and this is proof that Toronto police directly gave to me. They translated messages that said this person has written a poem about how he's going to rape me, and not only did he do that in Mandarin, he translated it and sent it to me in English. And till this day, I do not have a single case against anyone, nor do I know where these threats came from. Some were actually students, which some of my friends did research. Our school newspaper folks, the journalists, they went and actually did their own research, and they were like, these students are actually here because they have their T cards in some of their stories or on some of their social medias. And that's how we knew that this is actually serious. And there are students on our campus that are continuing to following me, surveil. They watch who I talk to. They were taking pictures while I was in our student union office throughout my presidency. And so that is just a taste of what it feels like to be subjected to harassment, intimidation here in a free and open society in Canada.
Zumratai, Canada has called the treatment of Uyghurs genocide. They did that in the House of Commons. Is that just lip service, or does it create any action for the Uyghurs themselves?
I think that's a good question. I think Canada has waited a long time to call this, what it is, a genocide, and to even act on this issue in a meaningful way. Although there was pressure coming from different groups, including parliamentarians. As you know, there is a Uyghur friendship group in the parliament that is focusing on this issue, and this is how this issue was brought up in the parliament in the first place. I think Canada did, act on surface level. They did introduce several regulations in terms of forced labor products coming in from East Turkestan, so-called Xinjiang region, and this was, of course, a good step, a first step, but it's not enough because the implementation was not very clear. Of course, they did this in coordination with the UK government and the US government, but and also they did introduce some sanctions against for Chinese officials who are responsible for these crimes, and also one entity. But I think that Canada is still running a lot behind. Of course, we don't like to compare ourselves with the United States, but the United States has done actually a lot in terms of this, genocide and meaningful action. They were the first country to recognize it and call it a genocide. They were the first government as well to adopt, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which really focuses on this issue. And they just before Christmas, they also passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So I don't know what Canada is waiting for. We need more actions, more concrete actions, like Chemi Lamo said. there's so much Canada can do. First of all, it can start with harassment, and our communities are always subjected to these harassments coming directly from the Chinese government. My own father, who's a Canadian citizen who visited the country in 2013, was taken by the Chinese security national police and interrogated a couple of times, and only was released when he accepted to spy for the Chinese government. Otherwise, he wouldn't be released. He of course said, "I'm a Canadian citizen. I don't owe you anything." They just threw his passport across the room and said, "Here, you're not a Canadian citizen. You're under our watch, under our control. So you're under Chinese law." And when he came back, actually, we of course reported this to the police, global affairs, everyone, and no single action was taken against this. These officials called him couple weeks after he got back to Canada, and we heard the officials ask him deliberately and openly if he had anything to report back to them in terms of actions within the community in Montreal, but also in Canada, and if he was connected to different organizations or leaders inside the movement. And when we approach people, parliamentarians, government officials, global affairs, no one did anything. The only people who were able to help were journalists that we approached and pitched the story to. And they reported on this. And it's just unbelievable to think that, there's not even one specific task force or unit in the government to address these specific issues, because this doesn't only happen to Tibetans or Uyghurs. It happens to anyone living under Chinese oppression, whether it's Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, or anyone, even Chinese dissidents in Canada. So I think it's really important that Canada does more. And one thing, because we did mention the two Michaels previously, I also want to remind folks here that there's also one Uyghur Canadian that's been detained since 2006. That's been to 16 years now. Hussein Jalil, who was a Canadian, citizen, he's been detained by the Chinese government, and he's been missing ever since. And we don't talk about him ever. And his wife and kids are still in Canada. They're still fighting for his release. We did so much on the two Michaels. Why can't we do the same for this man who is also a Canadian citizen?
Margaret, when you hear stories like those, obviously it concerns you, but where does the government come into, is that part of maybe there's a gap, a loophole, or something here where it doesn't seem the federal government is paying a lot of attention to some of the intimidation that's going on?
Yeah, I think that it's a really good point that there should be a nexus where people can go, one-stop shopping for harassment by Chinese agents in Canada. And there isn't, and people are just told to call the police, and the police don't do anything. So it's a very serious issue, and it's something that should be addressed. There should also be a registry of foreign agents in Canada acting on behalf of the Chinese government. Such registries exist in other countries, and we should have one as well. But in the shorter term, I'm hoping that the Olympics can be used to raise awareness of exactly what's going on in the Uyghur region of China. Certainly with the children particularly, where they've been taken away from their parents and put into this residential school system, basically, where they are being indoctrinated in Xi Jinping thought, and they're not allowed to speak their own language or practice their religion, even among one another, and they're punished if they do. And we've seen this story before, and it's the Canadian government needs to be raising this at the most senior levels in China, and I'm hoping that the opening ceremonies of the Olympics might see fewer Canadian athletes than would normally be seen marching behind the flag, because I think if athletes sit out the opening and closing ceremonies, that itself is a measure of our views on how China is conducting itself with its own citizens. And apart from that, we can choose not to watch the Olympics. I'm not going to be watching, and even inform the sponsors of the Olympics, which are all on the website of the IOC. Inform them that we're not going to be watching and why. It's important that these messages be given to the IOC, the COC, and the Canadian government.
Margaret.
Oh, go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, Margaret, why do you think in the end that Xi has insisted on carrying out these Olympics? It's a really risky move. I mean, the Japanese put it off for a year. I'm not sure, as I was saying, I'm not sure this is actually going to be a huge success for them in the end.
Well, I think it will be a success by the measure of what China is looking for in this event, and that is its own domestic market.
Oh, okay.
Its own domestic audience of people who are proud that China is the first to host 2 Olympics. The Beijing is the first to have both summer and winter Olympics. And there's going to be a big extravaganza displaying Chinese culture and in the opening and closing ceremonies.
So it's quite different than 2008, where China was really wanting to show its stuff to the world, trying to show how it was, advancing and how it was an attractive place. It doesn't seem to be interested what the world thinks of it anymore. At least she doesn't.
They're really not. They are taking whatever actions they want, which includes bullying other countries. But she is in a sensitive spot at this time, because there will be later in this year the big party Congress where he may be confirmed for another 5-year term, and that's what he's looking for. And so he doesn't want a single vote against him, and he's consolidating his power by putting in prison many senior party people, blaming them for corruption when really their fault is perhaps talking behind the scenes against his policies.
Elliot, I was going to say there's been an awful lot of action and words of Xi Jinping, and they seem to be building up his profile ahead of that National Party Congress coming up later this year. What do you expect is going to be the result of that?
The Party Congress, I quite concur, and you and I have discussed this in the past. We're talking today about the Olympics, and certainly the legitimacy of the party and Xi Jinping are partially on the line here. The prestige and the domestic audience, but the big ticket item for him is indeed the 20th Party Congress, which is coming up the end of next year sometime. And he wants to be sure that he is confirmed for basically leader for life, because they've already changed the constitution to permit that. The success, therefore, of these Olympics are one factor leading up to it, but the big ticket item there is that the fact that he might possibly face some opposition or some constraints on him if he is confirmed. This is the last gasp, the last chance of the many enemies or opponents that he has within the party and outside the party to do anything whatsoever to check this Red Emperor, as he's being called. So the Party Congress is coming up. He almost certainly will make it, but there's a chance. It's the last gasp, in a sense, for the kind of vision of China under a collective leadership, wisely moving the country into the future. And the Olympics factor into this just in one way, but it's a minor way compared to the big ticket item for him.
Bruce, China held the Summer Games in 2008, and here we are 14 years later. What, in your eyes, is different then, other than the actual pandemic? Obviously, that would be a big play of it. But what's different about China between the 14 years?
Well, first of all, I would say that from my conversations within China and my research, I would say that the number one target audience for 2008 was the domestic audience within China. And in all of my conversations with sports people and citizens in the cities that I visited, They didn't care at all about the foreign. They expressed pride over the ability of the emerging Chinese nation to hold this Olympic Games. When I expressed concern about the tremendous costs that the Games incurred, they say Chinese people aren't concerned about the cost. We're proud of the great success of those Games. And I think moving into this other area, many of those same narratives will continue. It is the Winter Games, but China is a winter country, at least the northern parts of the country. There's a huge ambition to create the infrastructure, the facilities, and the habits and the skills of winter sport as winter recreation. And that is a highly publicized ambition in conjunction with these games. I think it's from the sports community point of view, it's continuity. To be sure, we have seen the despotic side of China even more horribly over the last 14 years, and I think that in all of the communities we've identified, activists have been very astute and successful in drawing the world's attention to those atrocities, including what Chimmy talked about, the horrible persecution of her as an outstanding student leader at the University of Toronto Scarborough. Those are horrifying, and I think the world is much more aware of that. I'm not sure it's making any dent upon public opinion within China, though, and I think that's the target of these games.
Jimmy, we talk about the intimidation that you received, but that didn't seem to keep you from going to Greece to make your voice heard. Take us through that decision.
Definitely, because that is exactly what the Chinese government is trying to do, is to silence our voices. They've done that within our own homelands. They have displaced us as people, and they want to continue their harassment, intimidation through their long arm tactics with their partnerships and influence in free and open society like ours. Specifically the influence that they have in academic institutions, but that is a topic for another time. However, this time around with the Olympics, as folks earlier have already mentioned, the aim of this is legitimacy, be it internal or external. Both ways, the CCP is dying for legitimacy. Externally, I think this time around, they're actually trying to send a message to the world that they don't care about what the world thinks. And so it's trying to dominate is to assert their dominance because within China, the Politburo, you see the way they shuffle their leaders. Meng Wanzhou, who was initially party secretary of Tibet, was then replaced or moved to East Turkestan to do what he has been doing. All of the slave labor, the genocide has been crafted under him. And just recently, actually, Wanzhou, who was now initially at East Turkestan, has been promoted. And he's actually one of the most sanctioned people in the world, and he has been promoted to Tibet. And all human rights researchers, including Human Rights Watch, has been talking about how there is a severe danger to what Wanzhou and Xi Jinping will do inside of Tibet now, given that they have promoted them. So that's that. And then in terms of our athletes going there, they're just being used as a tool. It's a facade of legitimacy. And it's actually a very common tool that autocratics or authoritarian regimes use. They stage grand carnivals to create that facade of legitimacy. There's a crackdown of Chinese dissidents inside of China. I can't believe that we're sending athletes whose identities will not be accepted in China. Being a female, being a feminist, being an activist, being a parent. Imagine being a parent and having your child who's young as 4 years old being stripped away from you and being sent to colonial boarding schools to be taught another language so that you can be your identity can be erased. And that's exactly what's happening. About almost 1 million, 80% of Tibetan children as young as 4 years old have been forced or coerced into colonial boarding schools. And that's a report that just came out just weeks ago. And the situation inside of Tibet, East Turkestan, Hong Kong have only worsened. And in 2008, during Summer Olympics, it's good to hear that, Bruce, you had so many great interactions with locals. I wish you had an opportunity to talk to Tibetans. The wave of protest that happened in March 2008 till this day. Just earlier, I was talking about how mothers, retired doctors are actually still in prison for rising up in 2008 so that the international world will wake up. During that time, it was the Tibetans. And at that time, Hong Kongers were probably cheering on for the Chinese Olympic team. This time around, they're with us in our coalition. They're standing beside us, and we are calling and we're reaching out to athletes, having conversations with them and encouraging them not to go, but also having a conversation with them to let them know about what Olympics mean to us. Is it important that they attend and, bear the fruitions of their hard work of their whole life? Yeah, 100%. But athletes should have never been put in a position where they had to pick between a backdrop of genocide games and something that they've worked towards all of their lives. This calls for more representation of athletes into the committees, not just the government and other folks. Where do athletes where do the athletes come in this conversation? They shouldn't be put all of this pressure. The pressure and the blame should go back to the IOC. And I think it's important to go there.
All right. Now, Zoomer Tai, Canada says it stands with the Uyghur Muslims, and we had the declaration of the House of Commons, but nothing has really changed. And you mentioned Canada can do more. What can you point to a few countries that might be doing more to help the Uyghur Muslims in China?
I think I've kind of responded to this earlier, where the United States is doing more for sure, and some European countries are doing more as well, including the UK, which, this topic is discussed in Parliament every single week, and also countries like Germany, who are also, taking the Uyghur forced labor issue seriously. In France, there have been a couple of actions taken on forced labor as well. So I think, first of all, Canada should start by, a firmer approach on China. And I think now with the two Michaels home, they can allow, they can be more firm. One response that we would always get when meeting with Canadian officials was, well, with the two Michaels in China, we're kind of limited in what we can do. But now they don't have that anymore. Of course, we have Hussein Jalil, and they should be pushing for that. First of all, they should be, doing everything they can to reunite the family, and also creation of, some sort of task unit to address harassments, especially, with our communities where we are constantly harassed. And forced labor issue should be also one target. One thing that I also wanted to mention is, Chimi, you brought up Greece, and actually I was also in Greece with Chimi Lamo. I was the only one who was not arrested during that time because I was there for a press conference. If I was arrested, then no one would be speaking at the press conference. So, but during that press conference, while Chimi was in prison or in detention, I was giving that press conference in Athens the day they were having the torch relay in the Acropolis. We had a early press conference with all the journalists, and right after, two Chinese agents were following us. They were looking for us, specifically me and my other Tibetan colleague, Pamadoma. And we had to basically isolate ourselves in our press conference venue because these agents were specifically looking for us. And they were actually in the lobby area where they were waiting for us. And two of our Tibetan friends got arrested and taken to interrogation at a police station for doing absolutely nothing. And we were asked by the hotel management to leave the hotel despite our anxiety and we were stressed in that time because we knew that people were following us, even Greek nationals were following us. And the question of the issue of Beijing not caring about this was raised a little bit before, but I think Beijing cares a lot about what's happening. Otherwise, they wouldn't go to, to these lengths to harass activists in a democratic and free society. And it's not like we were Chinese nationals. We are Canadian, Swiss, American citizens who got harassed and intimidated openly by the Chinese government. So if they did not care, they wouldn't care about, activists like us. Who are we? We're small compared to the giant Chinese government. So I do disagree with the fact that Chinese government doesn't care, because otherwise they wouldn't harass us, harass our family members, harass dissidents, try to silence them. So I think they care a lot. And the one thing that Chemi also mentioned is that now, with the world's participation to these games, even though they're just Winter Olympics, it tells a lot, because China is using this opportunity to bolster their regime. And also it sends a clear message that with our participation, with athletes' participation, sponsors, broadcasters, everyone, it sends a message that, to Beijing, saying, Beijing will think, oh, look, I can do anything I want, even with the genocide I'm committing. And the world still is interested in participating to my games. That means that there's no accountability. There's no, punishment. There's no consequences for my crimes, for my actions. So that's why I think we should all boycott. And for, if not for, the suffering that our communities had to go through. I have over 40 members of my family that are interned or disappeared. And so in the face of that, I asked my government to just, boycott. And of course they did boycott diplomatically, but there should be more.
All right. Now, Alan, a lot of the Olympics obviously is about bolstering the impression of China, the impression of Jinping. He recently addressed the International Monetary Fund, calling for a hold on interest rates by the West. And we've been hearing how great the China economy has been humming. But, considering the recent real estate crisis there, is China really doing that well?
Well, the other issue, I'm not an economic expert at all on China. The other thing that I think that we see is happening behind some of these supply chain issues is that, this basic idea of zero COVID and basically locking down cities to stop, just a handful of cases. And this seems like this, Omicron is so infectious. It's going to, despite what they do, it's going to hit increasingly other parts of other cities. And China is already, I think, suffering from production problems, output problems. I can't believe that Omicron will not have a big impact on the Chinese economy. And so I think that that's another big issue for Xi, is not just the Chinese Congress, but maybe the Communist Party Congress, but also the economy. And he wants the economy to remain strong. Can you do this through a zero infection policy? I don't know. I mean, it's, we can see, of course, it's a freer society, but Australia is having big problems with a zero COVID policy. So it seems to me that it will have an economic impact.
Margaret, I'm wondering, Canada and China in terms of business, since they're, the two Michaels and all the other stuff that's been going on, there has been a growing sentiment about decoupling from China, like business-wise. Does that make sense, or is that just cutting off your nose in spite of your face?
Well, I think, in fact, it's China that's decoupling from the West. Yeah. They've been building a much thicker firewall, the Great Firewall of China, so that their own citizens can't get access to outside media. And they've been putting on much tighter rules and regulations for foreign companies in China. I've done a lot of work on Canadian technology company joint ventures and the problems they've run into in China, which have been really significant. So, we will continue to trade with China. They want our resources. But I think, Canadians are now starting to look broader in that region to having an Indo-Pacific strategy. And that's something that I think our government is likely to announce in the coming months. And I'm really looking forward to that. And that'll allow some of our companies to diversify their risk away from China when they've been having difficulty there. And I'd also like to say that I think our athletes will be looking for ways of speaking out about some of the atrocities we've been discussing. We know that among themselves, there have been a lot of discussions and what they can and can't do under Rule 50, it's called, of the IOC Charter. They are allowed to speak freely in media interviews, and I'm hoping that many will speak out about what's going on in Xinjiang. And I hope that they will not attend the opening and closing ceremonies to send a message to Beijing that they too object to the way that China is treating its own citizens.
Does the Canadian Olympic Committee permit the athletes not to attend these ceremonies?
Well, it's hard to say. Bruce would know better than I what's going on behind the scenes. I think COC wants just a nice, quiet games with no problems. Is that right, Bruce?
Yes, for sure. I think the question of participation in the opening ceremonies is complicated by both these political concerns and the logistics of location, because the Winter Games are spatially separated, the timing of your next event, and so on. Usually, because it's such an important moment in an athlete's rights, athletes fight for the right to march in the opening ceremonies and stay for the closing ceremonies. But these are very different circumstances because of the human rights concerns, because of COVID. So it's an open question for me. I do know that Canadian athletes have been educating themselves on this issue. They've been, screening presentations from some of the NGOs that are campaigning, in support of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and so on. And Rule 50 is considerably more liberal, more relaxed than it was in Beijing. So it's an open question. People are terrified that Western athletes will speak up and will be arrested by the Chinese police. And we're all pushing the IOC to insist that these are the world's games, not China's games, for which there is some precedent, and that the IOC will guarantee the safety of every Olympic participant in Beijing.
Well, folks, another great discussion. We've run out of time, but I want to thank our guests today on Unpublished TV. Elliot Tepper, professor of political science at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Alan Freeman is with the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Margaret McCaig-Johnson is a senior fellow with the Graduate School for Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Bruce Kidd, former Canadian Olympian and a professor of sport and public policy at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Jimmy Lamo is a Tibetan Canadian activist, and Zumratai Arkin is with the World Uyghur Congress. And I want to thank you for watching Unpublished TV. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.